The bag was lighter than it should have been. That was the detail that would stay with him, not the empty wardrobe, not the untouched jewels cold on the dressing table, not the silence that swallowed her chamber whole when he pushed the door open at first light. It would be the weight, the absence of it. The healer's bag she carried everywhere, worn leather, brass clasps, always heavy with tinctures and needle thread, and the small folding knife she used for root cutting and nothing else. It had hung on its hook by her door for 2 years. He had walked past it so many times he had stopped seeing it. Now the hook was bare. And King Fabian Flayton, Alpha King of Eldareth, unconquered in battle, unmoved in council, stood in the doorway of a woman's bedchamber and felt something crack open in his chest that had no name in any war language he had ever learned. She had left before midnight. She had been thorough about it. She had taken only what was hers. And somewhere in the dark beyond his castle walls, in the frost-bitten wilderness of a kingdom winter that had no intention of being merciful, she was carrying something that was his too, and she did not know yet what that would cost them both. Quick pause, comment where you're watching from, and if you're enjoying this story, please like and subscribe. I've got a lot more coming. Chapter 1. She had known for 11 days. Sophie Bronstad had carried the knowledge the way she carried everything difficult, quietly, practically, in the deep interior place where she put things that needed time before they could be spoken. She had confirmed it herself, alone in the castle's lower herb room before dawn, with 2 different test preparations, and the calm, clinical certainty of a woman who had been trained by her mother to read the body's signals without flinching. 7 weeks. She had sat on the cold stone floor of that room for a long time afterward with her back against the wall and her hands in her lap, and the knowledge settling over her like the first snow of winter, quietly, thoroughly, changing everything it touched. She had told herself she was waiting for the right moment to tell him. She understood now, standing in the castle's side corridor with her healer's bag packed, and the distant sound of the war drums beating ceremonial rounds from the great hall, that she had not been waiting for the right moment. She had been waiting for proof that the right moment existed. That there was a version of this conversation where Fabian Flayton would hear the news and reach for her hand and choose her. Not because she was useful, not because she happened to be there, but because 2 years of midnights in his library and the weight of his arm across her in the dark had meant something that could not be canceled by a council table. The war chamber had answered that question for her. She had come back from the lower village late, a difficult birth, a mother who had nearly bled out and a child who had come into the world fighting and won. She had been tired in the good way, the way that meant something real had been accomplished, and she had taken the back corridor through the east wing because it was shorter and she knew it in the dark. She had not been listening for anything. She had simply heard him. His voice was unmistakable. She had spent 2 years cataloging its registers, the cold command voice, the rare warm voice, the voice he used only with her in the dark of the library when he forgot, briefly, to be a king. This was the council voice, measured, definitive, the voice of a man arranging the pieces of a board he had already calculated to the end. She serves a purpose, but purpose has a season. The Thornwood lady brings lineage and a bonded claim. What Sophie Bronstad brings cannot be placed before a council table. She had stood in the corridor until her breathing steadied. She had pressed both palms flat against the cold stone wall and waited until the feeling in her chest settled from something sharp into something numb. And then she had placed one hand against the curve of her abdomen, and the numbness had clarified into something else entirely. Certainty. The clean, quiet certainty of a woman who had finally received the answer she had been too afraid to ask for. She had packed in the time it took the drums to beat 2 rounds. Her medicine kit. Her mother's copper ring. The carved wolf tooth her brother had pressed into her hand the day she left home. 3 days of dried meat and hard bread from the kitchen stores. Her plain wool cloak, her own, bought with her own coin, not the fine fur-lined one he had given her. She had left the sapphire earrings. She had left the gifted gowns. She had left the fur blanket she had quietly borrowed from his room on a cold night 3 months ago and told herself she would return. She left everything given. She took only what was already hers. The east postern gate was unlatched during feast nights. Kitchen boys used it for market deliveries. She slipped through it without ceremony, without looking up at the amber-lit windows of the life she was walking away from. And then the castle wall was behind her, and the forest was ahead, and the cold of the kingdom night hit her like a fist. She walked. The path to Asheville ran northeast along the ridge before dropping into the valley settlements beyond Eldureth's treaty maps. She had memorized it from the healer's route charts in the castle library months ago. In the half-aware way she cataloged everything useful, not planning, just knowing. She had heard of Sable Venn from 3 different village midwives who passed through the lower market. An elder widow, sharp-tongued, ungovernable. 0 patience for kings and considerable patience for women who had reason to run from them. Sophie intended to find out if that was true. She walked for 2 hours through frost-hardened forest before she stopped to check her bearings by the stars, her breath fogging the dark air. The castle was invisible behind her. No torchlight, no walls, no sound of drums. Just trees and cold sky and the distant cry of a night bird and the absolute, clarifying silence of a world that did not care about Eldureth's court politics. She pressed her palm to her belly, just briefly. Then she set her face northeast and walked on. Behind her, in a castle burning with feast light, a king was drinking to an alliance he did not yet know had cost him everything. He would find out at first light. By then, she was already deep in the trees, and the snow had begun to fall, and her footprints behind her were filling in with white, one by one, as if the forest itself was helping her disappear. Chapter 2. The snow was heavier by morning. Sophie had slept for 3 hours in the hollow of a downed oak, wrapped in her wool cloak with her bag pulled against her chest for warmth, and she woke to a world gone white and silent and so ferociously cold that the first breath she drew felt like glass in her lungs. She lay still for a moment, listening. Forest sounds whined through high branches. The soft, persistent hiss of falling snow. No hoofbeats. No dogs. No pursuit. She breathed out slowly and let herself feel, just for a moment in the privacy of the hollow, the full weight of what she had done. She had walked out of a king's castle in the middle of the night 7 weeks pregnant with his child. She had no official title, no formal claim, no one in the kingdom who would stand between her and whatever consequences followed. If Fabian wanted to find her, he had the resources of an alpha king, pack trackers, border scouts, wolf law that made runaway dependence a matter of territorial jurisdiction. But she was beyond the treaty maps, and she was not, technically, a dependent. She had never been officially anything. That, she thought, climbing out of the hollow into knee-high snow was the whole problem, wasn't it? She walked. The ridge path was barely visible under the snowfall, but she had the stars when the clouds thinned and the geography of the landscape itself. The way the land fell away to the northeast, the frozen creek that marked the boundary of the outer settlement territories. She had grown up reading landscape. Her mother had taught her that the land always told you where you were if you stopped expecting it to speak in words. She ate walking, dried meat, and hard bread, sparingly, drinking snow melt from a flat stone she held over the stub of candle she lit inside her cloak. A healer's trick. Waste nothing. Use what you have. Her mother's whole philosophy of life condensed into a practical instruction for surviving impossible situations. She thought about her mother a great deal during those first hours. About the copper ring on her right hand, worn smooth on the inner band from 30 years of her mother's wearing. About the way her mother had buried her husband and raised 3 children and built a healing practice from nothing in a village that had initially not wanted her, and had never once in her life described herself as someone who had been dealt a difficult hand. You play with what you're given, her mother had said once, stirring a fever reduction tincture with the focused calm of a woman who refused to catastrophize. And when they change the rules mid-game, you change how you play. You do not stop playing. Sophie touched the ring through her cloak. Then she adjusted her bag and walked faster. She reached Ashvale at midday. It was smaller than she had imagined. A cluster of stone-built cottages around a central well, smoke rising from every chimney. A few figures moving through the snow between buildings who stopped to watch her approach with the measuring stillness of people who had learned not to welcome strangers too quickly. A goat regarded her from a fenced yard with complete indifference. The settlement had the look of a place that had survived several things and intended to survive several more. An old woman was standing in the doorway of the largest cottage. She was perhaps 60, perhaps more. It was hard to tell with women who carried themselves like that, like the concept of age had tried its luck with them once and then moved on. She had gray hair pulled back hard and a face built for neither warmth nor coldness, just for seeing clearly. She was looking at Sophie the way Sophie had sometimes seen old healers look at a new patient, cataloging, assessing, already several steps ahead. "You've come a long way on foot in new snow," the woman said. It was not a question. "Sable Venn," Sophie said. "Who's asking?" "Sophie Bronstad. I'm a healer. I need somewhere to stay." The old woman's gaze moved, very briefly and very deliberately, to the slight curve beneath Sophie's cloak. Then it moved back to her face. "You're running from someone," Sable said, also not a question. Sophie held her gaze and did not flinch. "I'm walking toward something. There's a difference." The silence that followed lasted long enough that the snow falling between them accumulated visibly on Sophie's cloak. Then the corner of Sable's mouth shifted, not quite a smile, but something in that direction. The expression of a woman who had just been given an answer she found acceptable. "The cottage at the east end has been empty since last harvest," she said. "The hearth draws well. Come eat first." She stepped back into the doorway. "And take those boots off before you come in. You're tracking half the mountain." Sophie pulled off her boots on the threshold and stepped inside. The fire was enormous and warm, and she stood in front of it for a long moment with her hands extended, and her eyes closed, and let herself feel the heat reach her all the way through. From behind her she heard the sounds of Sable moving around a kitchen, pot on hook, ladle, the smell of something heavy and root-based coming to a boil. "How far along?" Sable asked from the kitchen. Sophie did not startle. 7 weeks. "Father." The pause, not part of the plan. The sound of a pot being stirred. They never are, and yet here we all are. Sophie opened her eyes and looked at the fire. Outside the window, the snow kept falling, soft and relentless, covering the tracks that led here from Eldareth's gates. She was safe. For now. She did not let herself think about what for now meant. She let herself think about the warmth and the smell of the soup and the fact that she had done what needed doing. She had walked toward something. She would build the rest when she got her boots dry. Chapter 3. The castle knew before Fabian did. That was the nature of pack households. The scent of distress moved through stone corridors the way a cold draft did, finding every crack, reaching the lowest servants' quarters and the highest tower rooms with equal indifference. By the time the king came down to the great hall for morning council, the quality of the silence told him something was wrong. Not the absence of sound, the castle was never truly silent, but the texture of it. The way eyes moved away from him too quickly. The way his steward's jaw was set with the particular tension of a man building up to a delivery he did not want to make. "She's gone," Fabian said, not a question. He had known it the moment he walked past her chamber door, and the smell of her, healer's herbs and winter air, and the warm thread scent that was purely, specifically Sophie, had simply not been there. After 2 years, that scent was woven into the castle's atmosphere the way smoke was, pervasive, unnoticed until it wasn't. The absence of it had hit him like a blade between the ribs, and he had kept walking, kept his face neutral, kept his stride even, because he was the alpha king, and 20 years of discipline did not break because a woman was not where she should have been. He had gone to her chamber anyway. He had stood in the doorway and seen the bare hook and the empty wardrobe and the untouched jewels, and understood in one comprehensive and devastating moment exactly what had happened. Not an accident, not an emergency, a decision made with the clean deliberateness of someone who had thought it through entirely and executed it without hesitation. She had taken her bag. She had left everything he had given her. He had stood there for a long time. Now he sat at the head of the council table and looked at his advisors and kept his voice level. "When?" "Sometime before midnight, my lord," said his steward, Aldrich. "The east postern gate. The kitchen boy saw a woman matching her description leaving the lower courtyard just after the second feast drum." "Alone?" "Yes." "Direction?" The pause. "Northeast, my lord, the forest track." "Northeast, beyond the treaty maps, toward the outer settlement territories." Fabian knew exactly what was out there. He had drafted those treaty boundaries himself 7 years ago, and he knew precisely where his jurisdictional reach ended and the ungoverned settlements began. If she had gone northeast with intention, she had known that. She had known exactly where to go where he could not simply order her return. He was quiet for a moment. The council watched him with the careful stillness of men who had learned over years exactly how much space to leave around the king when he was thinking. Then Aldrich said, carefully, "My lord, there is something else." Fabian looked at him. Aldrich was 60 years old and had served 3 generations of Flayton kings, and was not, as a rule, a man who looked uncomfortable. He looked uncomfortable now. He held the king's gaze with obvious effort and said, "The pack trackers reported to me this morning before council. When they swept the east corridor for the overnight report," he stopped, began again. "The scent they recorded from her chamber in the last week has shifted, my lord. The trackers say it carries a secondary signature." The council chamber went very quiet. Fabian did not move. "Say it plainly, Aldrich." The old man met his eyes. "She is with child, my lord." The silence that followed was the kind that had weight to it, the kind that changed the shape of a room. Fabian sat at the head of his table and felt the information land in him like something thrown from a great height, and he did not let a single thing he felt reach his face, because there were 12 men in this room, and he was their king, and the alpha did not break in council. But behind his eyes, something was happening that he had no language for. A reckoning that was arriving all at once, not just the fact of the child, but the full accumulated consequence of every choice he had made in 2 years. The title he had never given her, the mark he had never placed, The Thornwood conversation he had apparently had within earshot of the woman he had, the woman he. 12 men were watching him. "Clear the room," he said. They went without a word, even Aldrich. The door closed behind the last of them with a sound that was very small and very final, and Fabian sat alone at the head of his council table, in the silence he had created and breathed. He thought of the library at midnight. Her hair loose, her feet tucked under her in the big chair by the fire, reading something medical and occasionally reading pieces of it aloud to him with the unself-conscious enthusiasm of someone who had genuinely forgotten he was a king. He thought of the morning 3 months ago when he had found her in the herb garden before dawn, her hands full of frost-edged rosemary, her face turned up to the first pale light with an expression he had looked at too long and not named. He thought of his own voice in this very room, measured, deliberate. Purpose has a season. He stood up abruptly, walked to the window. The castle yard below was white with last night's snow, and beyond the east wall the forest was gray-green and dense, and somewhere in that wilderness a woman was walking away from him with his child and 7 weeks of a secret he had given her no reason to share. He had done this. He needed to understand that fully before he decided what to do next. Not move immediately, not send scouts, not invoke wolf law, understand it. Sit with the shape of what he had built and destroyed without ever once asking her what she wanted. He pressed his hand flat against the cold glass of the window and looked northeast. She had a head start of 8 hours in fresh snow. She was a lowland girl who knew how to move in winter. She was a healer with enough supplies to survive a week and enough stubbornness. He knew, he had always known, to last considerably longer. He was going to have to earn the right to find her. He was not yet sure he had. Chapter 4. Asheville was not what Sophie had expected. She had expected refuge. She had not expected to belong. The first week she kept herself careful, useful without becoming dependent, warm without becoming comfortable, present at meals, and helping where she could without making herself either conspicuous or necessary. She had learned that instinct in the castle, the half-life of a woman who existed in a powerful man's space without a formal claim on it. Be useful, be quiet, take up exactly the amount of room you were permitted, and not 1 inch more. Sable watched her do this for 5 days, and then, on the 6th morning, set a cup of tea in front of her and sat down across the table with the expression of a woman who had decided something. "You're doing that thing," Sable said. Sophie looked up. "What thing?" "The small thing, the careful thing. The thing women do when they've learned that taking up space is a risk." She wrapped both hands around her own cup. "This is Asheville. Nobody here is measuring how much room you use." Sophie was quiet for a moment. Outside the cottage window, 2 of the settlement children were chasing a goat through the snow, shrieking with delight. "Old habits," she said finally. "I know," Sable said, not unkindly. "Break them." It was easier than she expected. Asheville had its own rhythms. The pre-dawn feeding of animals, the communal fire in the evenings where 3 or 4 households gathered to share food and mend things and talk, the market run to the nearest village every 8 days, where Sable bartered preserved goods and wool yarn for what the settlement couldn't produce itself. Sophie folded herself into these rhythms with the ease of someone who had grown up in a village household, and then spent 2 years aching for the texture of one. The castle had been beautiful. It had also been profoundly lonely in the way that only large inhabited spaces can be full of people who were not for her. Asheville, somehow, immediately was. She was treating her first patient by the end of the first week, a child with a rattling chest cough that she recognized as the early stages of a winter lung infection, treatable with a steam preparation, and a specific honey and thyme compound she had the components for. The child's mother looked at her with the particular desperate gratitude of a parent watching symptoms improve, and something cracked open in Sophie's chest that she had not known was sealed. This was what she was for. This, specifically. Not standing in stone corridors, waiting to overhear her own obsolescence. She built the days carefully. Work in the mornings. Sable was teaching her the particular medicinal knowledge of the highland plants, which overlapped with but was distinct from lowland healing, and the exchange felt generative and real. The afternoons she walked, carefully, slowly, in consideration of the cold and her condition, but she was not the kind of woman who rested well, and the landscape was stunning in its winter severity, all granite ridges and frost-heavy pines, and the occasional far glimpse of the valley that lay between Ashvale and the distant smear of smoke that was, on clear days, Eldareth. She tried not to look at that. She was not always successful. The child grew, quietly and persistently, in the way of things that have decided they are going to exist regardless of the circumstances of their arrival. The nausea was manageable. The tiredness was fierce and periodic. She ate more than she would have thought possible. Sable's cooking was substantial and unadorned and relentless, the cooking of a woman who had understood hunger in her youth and now treated it as a personal enemy. Sophie ate everything placed in front of her and was obscurely grateful. She did not think about Fabian. She was very deliberate about this. She thought about the child instead. She thought about what kind of person a child grew into when it was wanted completely, from the beginning, without contingency. She thought about names. She thought about her mother's hands teaching her to read a pulse, steady and precise, and utterly without hesitation. And she thought about teaching those same things to someone who was half her, who had her blood and her stubbornness, and her mother's stubbornness before that. A long line of women who had refused to let difficulty be the final word. She was building something. For the first time in 2 years, she was building something that was entirely hers. She would not let herself need it to be more than that. Not yet. Not while the castle was still a smear of smoke on the horizon, and she did not know what was moving in the space between them. But at night, in the small cottage that was starting to smell of her herbs and her candles, and the particular warmth of a fire tended by the same hands every evening, she let herself feel the beginning of something that might, eventually, become peace. She pressed her palm to the growing curve of her belly and listened to the wind in the highland pines and did not cry. That, she decided, counted. Chapter 5. Fabian did not send trackers. This surprised his council. It surprised Aldrich so visibly that the old man had to smooth his expression with deliberate effort when the king informed him that there would be no pursuit order, no pack retrieval, no invocation of wolf law regarding territorial dependence. There would be, Fabian said, in the flat voice that indicated the decision had been made and the conversation was over, a period of time in which the king dealt with certain obligations. What obligations? Aldrich did not ask. He had served long enough to know when the king was operating on a level that was not available for discussion. What Fabian was actually doing was thinking. Not the tactical thinking that came naturally, not moving pieces on a board, not calculating advantages, but the harder kind. The kind that required sitting with a thing until he could see it clearly instead of the way he had been seeing it, which was through the distorting lens of 2 decades of having learned that attachment was a vulnerability, and vulnerability was a liability, and the only way to protect what mattered was to maintain enough distance from it that losing it would not undo him. He had maintained very thorough distance from Sophie Bronstad. He had done it so effectively that he had apparently convinced her that she was temporary while intending, on some level he had never examined, for her to be permanent. He sat in the library for 3 nights running. It was worse in the library. Her chair was still pulled slightly toward the fire, the way she always left it, at an angle he had told her once was impractical for the lighting, and she had disagreed with entirely, because she had never in her life agreed with him about anything she had an actual opinion on, which was everything. The blanket she had borrowed from his room was gone from the arm of the chair. That was new. He had noticed that on the first night and had not been able to unnotice it since. He made himself think about the child. He had not let himself do that fully yet, had kept it in the peripheral of his consciousness, a fact he acknowledged but had not yet sat inside. Now he sat inside it, a child, his child. A Flayton heir who was currently somewhere in the Highland wilderness with a woman who was furious at him and had every right to be, and who was 7 weeks pregnant and had walked through a kingdom winter alone because he had been conducting a council meeting within her earshot that reduced her to a temporary arrangement with an expiration date. He thought about what kind of father a man became when his first act in relation to his child's mother was to demonstrate, publicly and unambiguously, that she was interchangeable. He thought about his own father, the court his father had kept, the ways in which the Flayton bloodline had a particular history with treating people who loved them as political assets until the cost came due. He had sworn at 19, standing over his father's body after a war his father had started because a woman had finally left him, and he had chosen war over accountability, that he would never be that man. He had been so careful not to be that man that he had become a different version of the same failure. Not volatile and consuming, but cold and withholding. Not refusing to let her leave, but making her believe she needed to. On the 4th night, he sent for his fastest rider and wrote 2 letters. The first was to the Thornwood court, withdrawing his interest in the proposed alliance with a brief diplomatic formality that would require 3 months of careful management to smooth over. He did not particularly care. The second letter he wrote longer, several times, and burned each draft before the final version, which he read back once and then sealed. He gave it to the writer with a description of the settlement territory northeast of the ridge and the name Sable Ven, and told the writer it was to be delivered by hand with no royal seal visible, as a private communication, and that the writer was to tell no one what he had carried or where he had gone. Then he prepared to follow himself. Not immediately. The letter needed to arrive first. He needed her to have his words before she had to look at his face, because he knew her well enough, even across 2 years of deliberate distance, to know that if he arrived in person before she had had time to hear him, the conversation would happen on a battlefield before it could happen anywhere real. He prepared for a journey, not a royal progress, 2 horses, no retinue, traveling clothes, provisions. Aldrich looked at the preparations and opened his mouth. Fabian looked at him. Aldrich closed his mouth. "I will be gone 10 days," Fabian said. "The council can manage border reports. If the Thornwood delegation arrives, tell them I am delayed on a personal matter and offer them the East Wing hospitality. And if they ask the nature of the personal matter, tell them the king has gone to do something he should have done a long time ago." He picked up his riding gloves. "That will be accurate enough." He rode out before dawn, alone, into a landscape still white and silent with last week's snow. The cold hit him cleanly, and he rode into it without flinching, because he was the Alpha King and he had made the calculation, and the calculation was simple. She was worth the cold. She was worth the distance. She was worth whatever she needed from him before she would look at him as a man again instead of a mistake. He had 2 days of hard writing ahead of him, and a letter arriving before him, and a conversation coming that he had no guarantee of surviving intact. He wrote anyway. Chapter 6. Sophie read the letter 3 times. Sable had placed it on the table in front of her without comment. Just set it down beside the morning tea, with the care of someone placing a thing that might need space around it, and then gone to the far end of the cottage to do something loudly and pointedly domestic that gave Sophie the privacy the moment required. The letter was written on plain paper, not the crested court parchment she would have expected, just paper and ink and his handwriting, which she recognized immediately with a physical jolt she had not been prepared for. No salutation. It began simply with, "I heard myself through your ears tonight." That is to say, I have been thinking about what it would be like to hear those words from outside the room, from the position of someone who had no context for how cold I had learned to sound when I was afraid of something. I am trying, for the first time in longer than I want to admit, to be honest about what I am afraid of. I am afraid of this letter. I am afraid you will read it and find it insufficient, because it is insufficient. I am afraid I have no language for what I should have told you 2 years ago, and possibly longer. I am afraid of what it means that my first genuine reckoning with that is happening now, on paper, because you are no longer in the castle for me to avoid it in person. I know about the child. I want you to know that I know, not so that you feel found, but so that you understand I am not writing to you as a king writing to a subject. I am writing as the person most directly responsible for the fact that you walked out into a kingdom winter alone, and I do not have a word large enough for what that is, but the closest I can get is, I am sorry, not the diplomatic sorry. The kind that means I have looked at what I did clearly and I understand the shape of the damage and I would undo it if I could, and since I cannot undo it, I intend to be worth something going forward. If you will allow me the opportunity to demonstrate that, you do not have to. I am asking. I am not requiring. I will be in the Asheville territory in 2 days. I am not coming to retrieve you. I am coming because I have spent 4 days in the library in your chair. Yes, I found the angle. You were right. The lighting is better. And I have concluded that the things I should have said to you over the course of 2 years are owed to you in person, and some choices cannot be made on paper. If you do not want to see me, tell Sable Venn and I will honor it. I will find another way to be accountable that does not require you to look at me before you are ready. But I would like the chance to look at you. To tell you in the plainest words I have what you are to me, what you have always been even when I was too cowardly to name it. Wherever you are in this letter, I hope you are warm. See, Sophie set the letter down, picked it up. Read the middle paragraph again, set it down. He's coming, she told Sable. Sable stirred the porridge. I know, the writer told me. You didn't tell me. I wanted you to read it first. A pause, before you decided. Sophie looked at the letter on the table, at his handwriting, which she had seen before on council dispatches left on his desk. The angular, controlled handwriting of a man who held everything tightly and which looked different now. Not different in form, different in what it was holding. She could see, in the particular pressure of the pen on certain words, the places where he had written slowly. She thought about the warm voice, the library voice. The voice that said her name not as a summons but as a relief. She thought about the corridor, the stone cold under her palms. The clinical, unhesitating assessment of her dispensability. She thought about the child and what she had decided she was building here, and whether what she was building had room in it for the person she was still, against every sensible intention, furious at and missing in equal measure. "What do I do?" she said. It was not quite a question. Sable set 2 bowls on the table and sat down. "You eat first," she said. Big decisions on empty stomachs are how women end up back in situations they just left. Sophie almost laughed. She picked up her spoon. "After that," Sable said, "you decide what you want, not what's practical, not what's fair, what you want." She met Sophie's eyes across the table. "Everything else comes after." Sophie ate. Outside the cottage window, the highland pines were silver-white with frost, and the sky was the pale, clear blue of a winter morning that had decided to be beautiful, and somewhere on the northeast ridge a man on horseback was riding toward her, alone, without his crown. She pressed her hand to her belly under the table and thought about what she wanted. She had 2 days to decide. Chapter 7. He arrived on the 2nd day, at dusk. Sophie saw him from the path above the settlement. She had been walking the ridge route, the one that gave her a view of the valley below and the high sky above, and the particular silence that helped her think. She saw the 2 horses picking along the lower track before she recognized the rider, and then the quality of his movement told her before anything else did. That specific stillness in the saddle. The way he moved through space like a man who understood gravity was a negotiation. Her chest did a complicated thing. She did not go down to meet him. She stood on the ridge path and watched him come through the settlement gate, and a woman, she thought it was Wren, the blacksmith's wife, come out to take his horses, and she watched him stand in the central yard and look around and then look up with the instinct of a wolf finding the high ground directly to where she was standing. He was too far away to read his face. She could see only that he had found her. She walked back down. He was waiting at the edge of the settlement, outside the central yard, when she came through the trees. He had not gone to the cottage. He had not moved toward her. He had stopped at the boundary of the settlement and stayed there, which told her he had understood what she needed, that she would come to him, or she wouldn't, and the choice was hers. She stopped 10 feet away. He looked, she had to absorb this, he looked tired. Not the performative exhaustion of a king who had overworked himself for the court's benefit, but the genuine tiredness of a man who had not been sleeping. He had ridden in traveling clothes, no guard, no ceremony. His hair was wind-disordered. She had never seen him wind-disordered. It was a small and specific detail that did something unhelpful to her chest. "Sophie," he said, the library voice, the voice that said her name not as a summons. "You came alone," she said. "Yes." "No guard, no trackers, no Wolflaw retrieval order." "No." She looked at him. "Why?" He held her gaze. "Because I am not here to retrieve you. I am here to answer for what I did, and to ask." He stopped, breathed, continued. "To ask what it would take. For you to believe that what I said in that council room was not the truth of what you are to me. That it was a cowardice I dressed up in strategy, and I have spent the last week understanding exactly how much it cost you, and I am here because I could not conduct that understanding from a library 2 days' ride away." The wind moved through the pines. Somewhere in the settlement, a child called out and was answered. Sophie said, "You told your council I had no lineage and no bond, and that I couldn't be placed before a council table." "Yes. Those things are true. The lineage is irrelevant, the bond." His jaw tightened. "The bond is mine to give. I chose not to because I was afraid of what it would mean, what it would expose. I told myself I was being pragmatic and I was lying to myself, which means I was lying to you by omission for 2 years. He held her gaze steadily. "That is the most honest thing I can tell you. I was a coward. I used politics as a wall and I kept you on the other side of it, and you deserved better than that every single day." Sophie was quiet for a moment. The evening was going blue and cold around them, the first stars appearing in the east. "The child," she said. "I know. This does not change because of the child. I need you to understand that. If I choose anything here, it is not because I am carrying your heir and have decided the politics of that make compliance reasonable. I will raise this child in Asheville before I will raise it in a court where its worth is calculated before it can speak." Something moved in his face, not offense, something closer to recognition. "I know," he said again. "That is not why I came." He stepped forward one step and stopped himself. "I came because you are the variable I cannot calculate, and I have spent 2 years pretending that was a problem rather than the only thing in my kingdom that has ever felt like a fact." The silence between them had a different quality now, still cautious, still wounded. But something had opened in it, a crack of light under a door. "You're going to have to show me," Sophie said. "Not tell me, show me, consistently, over time. I am not going to be convinced by a letter and a 2-day ride." "I know. And I make the terms." "Yes." She looked at him for a long moment. The wind moved through her hair. Behind her, the settlement lights were coming on, warm and small against the winter dark. "You can stay in the empty cottage at the West End," she said finally. "There's a hearth that draws and a cot. Sable will tell you the settlement rules." She turned back toward the path. "Supper is in an hour. You're expected to wash first." She walked away. Behind her, she heard him breathe, a long, careful exhale, as if he had been holding it for the entire 2-day ride. Good, she thought. He should have been. Chapter 8. He stayed. This was the thing that surprised her. She had half expected him to frame the situation as a temporary concession, a diplomatic visit, a gesture of good faith, and then back to the castle and the councils and the elaborate machinery of his actual life. She had braced herself for that. She had decided she was fine with that. He unpacked his saddlebags and brought firewood to Sable without being asked, and submitted to the elder widow's assessment, with the composed attention of a man who had understood immediately that Sable Venn was a more important authority in this territory than he was. Sable had assessed him for a long moment after supper that first night and said, "You're useful, at least. I'll give you that." Fabian had said, "Thank you," without irony. Sable had looked at Sophie across the table with an expression that said, He integrated into the settlement's rhythms with a thoroughness that Sophie found, despite herself, difficult to dismiss. He was not performing usefulness. He was genuinely useful, in the blunt physical way of a man who had been trained for war since childhood, and had a body built for exertion and no particular pride about what the exertion was in service of. He repaired the east fence that had been weakening since autumn. He helped Wren's husband haul timber. He sat at the communal fire in the evenings and listened more than he spoke, which for a king was, Sophie suspected, a considerable exercise of will. She watched him. She was not ready yet to let him watch her watching, so she was careful about it, the oblique healer's attention, the peripheral observation. She noticed the way he looked up whenever she appeared in the yard, not quickly, not hungrily, just with the steady attentiveness of a man checking on something important. She noticed that he did not push. He did not engineer proximity. He showed up and he was present and he waited. After a week, she started leaving her cottage door open when she was working at the table. This was not an invitation. It was a test. He walked past 3 times before she called out to him. "Come in," she said, without looking up from the herb sorting she was doing. He came in. He sat down in the chair across the table. He picked up the bundle of dried thyme she indicated and began stripping the leaves in the direction she showed him without being asked to explain the process or defend his competence. They worked in silence for a while. "You're good at following instructions," she said. "I have been told I am not," he said. "Generally. From people who weren't me. From everyone who wasn't you." A pause. "You are the only person in my memory who has told me I was doing something wrong and been correct, and I listened anyway." He was quiet for a moment, focused on the time. "I thought about that, about why. I think it is because you were never interested in being right at my expense. You were interested in the thing being done correctly." Sophie was quiet. "Then, your father." He looked up. "I read about him in the castle library. There are 3 different historical accounts." She kept her eyes on the herbs. "He destroyed a border alliance because a woman left him, started a war over it." "Yes. You learned that attachment leads to bad decisions." He held her gaze. "I learned that from him, and then I spent 20 years being careful not to be him, and in the process—" He stopped. "You built walls instead of bridges," she said, not unkindly, clinically, the way she said difficult things when she needed them to be heard. "Yes," his voice was quiet. "And you were on the wrong side of them." The herbs between them smelled of summer in a winter room. Outside the window the snow had started again, soft and particular, the kind that fell without wind. "I am not your father," Sophie said. "Loving you was not a war I was running." "I know that now." "You should have known it then." "Yes," he said simply. "I should have." She looked at him across the table. He was not arguing. He was not deflecting or qualifying or dressing it in strategy. He was sitting in the truth of what he had done without trying to make it smaller, and the absence of his usual armor was so complete that she felt something shift in her, not toward forgiveness, not yet, but toward possibility. "The child moves," she said. He went very still. "At night, mostly. Small, I can barely feel it yet, more like pressure than movement. But it's there." She pressed her hand to her side where she had felt it last. "Last night was the first time it was clear enough to be certain." He looked at her hand, then at her face. His own expression had opened in a way she had never seen in the castle, the full king mask gone, all the careful distance stripped back, and underneath it a man who looked, quite simply, undone by the fact of what she had just told him. "May I?" He stopped. "No," she said quietly. "Not yet." He nodded. He looked back down at the herbs. He continued working with the focused care of a man who had been given a clear boundary, and understood that honoring it was itself the answer to the question he had not been allowed to ask. They finished the herbs. She made tea. He drank it without speaking. When he left for the night, he said, "Thank you for telling me." She said nothing, but she did not close the door until he was out of sight in the dark. Chapter 9. The rival pack arrived on a Thursday. Sophie heard about it before she saw it, the particular tension that moved through Asheville at mid-morning, the way the men and women near the settlement's northern boundary started appearing with that watchful stillness that was different from the usual Highland alertness. Sable was at the communal well when Sophie found her, talking in a low voice with Wren's husband and a third person Sophie didn't recognize, and the way Sable's jaw was set told her everything she needed to know about the severity before a word was spoken. "Graving pack," Sable said when she saw Sophie. 3 riders. They came in under a trade flag, but they're border scouts. They've been asking about the settlement's visitors." The settlement's visitors, which meant Sophie. "They know I'm here," Sophie said. They've been moving through this territory for 3 days. One of them has tracker-level scent. Yes, they know. Sable met her eyes. They may not know about the child yet. But a pregnant alpha heir is valuable leverage in a pack dispute, and the Graving clan has had a territorial grievance against Eldareth for a long time. Sophie felt the cold of it settle over her, not panic, the clean cold of assessed risk. Her healer's brain already calculating. Where is Fabian? North Fence. He was, Sable stopped, because Fabian was already there. He had come across the yard at a controlled pace that was not quite running, with the particular focus of a man who had heard something on the wind that no one else had caught yet. He looked at Sophie first. Just briefly, just a full-body check, there you are, not hurt, good, and then at Sable. Graving, he said. 3 riders at the north boundary. How long? They arrived this morning. They haven't come in. Fabian was quiet for a moment, calculating. They're waiting to see if she leaves the settlement perimeter. An alpha heir in open territory is easier to move. He looked at Sophie. You need to stay inside the settlement boundary. I know that, she said. Something moved in his face at her tone, not amusement, something warmer and more complicated than that. I know you know, I'm saying it because I need to say it. He looked back at Sable. Are there other exits? South track and the river crossing, but the river is frozen. The frozen crossing is faster for horses. He thought, they'll have that covered, which means they're assuming whoever they want to move will be on foot. He looked at the northern tree line. They're not expecting to have to manage the Alpha King. You don't have your guard, Sophie said. No, he looked at her. I have myself. That has been sufficient historically. This is not a battlefield. No, it is a diplomatic situation that I am about to resolve diplomatically. The voice had changed, not the cold council voice, but something else, a third register she had not heard before. Settled and absolute and carrying a weight that had nothing to do with performance. The Graving clan has a grievance with Eldareth. I have the authority to address that grievance. I will address it. They will leave. He started toward the north boundary. Fabian. He stopped, looked back at her. She did not have the words for what she wanted to say. She looked at him for a moment, this man who had ridden 2 days alone and carried firewood and stripped thyme leaves and sat across from her in the dark and received her anger with the careful steadiness of someone who had decided to deserve it. Standing now on the edge of something that could go badly wrong, with no guard and no crown, just himself. Be careful, she said. It was not enough. She said it anyway. Something crossed his face, not a smile. Something that was the shape where a smile had been and might be again. Always, he said, and walked on. She stood with Sable and waited. The negotiation took 2 hours. She could see nothing from the settlement, just the northern tree line and the occasional movement of figures too distant to read. Sable had arranged for the children to stay inside, and the settlement's own men to be visible and unobtrusive at the boundary markers. Enough presence to signal the settlement was not undefended without escalating. They had done this before, in other configurations. Asheville had survived a long time by understanding exactly how much strength to show, and when. When Fabian came back through the northern gate, he was alone and unhurried, and the tension was gone from the tree line. He walked to where Sophie was standing. They're withdrawing, he said. I have offered a trade route concession that will take about 3 months of council work to formalize, but addresses the core of their grievance. They have my word on it, which, in wolf law, carries treaty weight. Sophie looked at him. You traded a political concession for my safety. I traded a just concession for the resolution of a genuine grievance. Your safety was an adjacent benefit. He held her gaze, though not a minor one. Sable, standing a few feet away, made a sound that was not quite a snort. "I'm going to start supper," she said, and walked away with the studied indifference of a woman removing herself from a conversation she had decided should happen without her. Sophie and Fabian stood in the yard with the winter cold settling around them, and the settlement resuming its rhythms and the particular silence of two people on the edge of something neither of them was quite ready to step into. "You didn't have to come here yourself," she said. "You could have sent that concession by diplomatic writer and resolved the graving matter from Eldureth." "Yes. You chose to be here." "Yes. Why?" He looked at her for a long moment. The sun was going down behind the western ridge, painting the snow gold and the pine shadows long and blue, and the quality of the light made everything look like something that deserved to be remembered. "Because you are here," he said. "That is the complete answer." She held his gaze, he held hers. The child moved, very small and very certain underneath her hand. "Come to supper," she said finally. "Sable makes enough for 3. She walked to the cottage. She did not look back, but she left the door open. Chapter 10. The child was born on a morning in early spring, when the last of the Asheville snow was pulling back from the southern slopes, and the highland pines were beginning to release their winter weight, and the air had the first faint edge of something warming underneath the cold. Sophie had known it was close for a week. She had felt the shift in her body the way she had been trained to feel such things, not with fear, with the clear, assessor's attention of a healer reading signals, cataloging, preparing. She had told Sable, who had sent word to the nearest midwife 2 valleys over, and she had set her own supplies out and made the cottage ready and done all the practical things, and then she had let herself sit in the good chair by the fire for an hour with her hands in her lap and let herself feel, without analysis, what it meant that she was about to do this. She was not afraid. She had been afraid of many things in the last months, of what she was building, of whether it was enough, of the slow and careful negotiation of trust that had been happening in this settlement, with the particular patience of 2 people who understood they were handling something that could not be rushed. She had been afraid in the quiet of too many nights that she would build all of it and still not be certain. But she was not afraid of this. She was ready. Fabian was in the north yard when her labor began. He was at her door, she did not know how. There had been no signal in the time it took her to cross the cottage and put her hand on the door frame. He looked at her face and knew, and she saw the specific thing that happened in his eyes. The fear and the love and the helplessness of a person who understood they were about to witness something they could not control or fix, only be present for. "Sable is coming," he said. His voice was steady. His hands, when she reached for the doorframe, were immediately there. "Tell me what you need." She told him. He did those things. He was exceptional at following instructions from her. She had already known that, and he did not offer opinions or try to manage the situation or behave like a king to whom authority naturally gravitated. He was simply there, steadily and completely, doing what she asked when she asked it, and the steadiness of him was something she had not known she needed until she had it. The midwife arrived from the valley. Sable took over. Fabian was moved to the outer room. Sophie heard him once ask Sable a question, and heard Sable's answer short and direct and somewhat bracing, and heard his silence after it, which had the quality of a man accepting fear as the price of something he cared about deeply enough to be afraid for. The labor was long but uncomplicated. Her mother's hands were not here. but Sable's were, and the midwife's, and the accumulated knowledge of 3 generations of Highland healers moving through the room in practical expertise. And Sophie labored with the same focused steadiness with which she did everything. Not without pain, not without effort, but without surrender. Her daughter arrived at mid-morning. Furious and loud and pink-faced and already, somehow, clearly a person who had decided she was going to be here and intended everyone to know it. Sable placed her in Sophie's arms. Sophie looked at her daughter and felt something happen in her chest that she had no medical name for, a vast, structural, permanent shift, like a tectonic event, like something that had always been waiting to occur and had now occurred, and the world would simply be different hereafter. "Hello," she said. Her voice was very quiet and completely certain. "I know you. I've been waiting." Her daughter made a sound that was, somehow, already argumentative. Sophie laughed. Completely, genuinely laughed, for the first time in longer than she could calculate, and the laugh had tears in it which she did not bother to qualify, because her daughter was here and she was healthy and fierce, and the room smelled of wood smoke and fresh linen and Highland pine coming through the window, and she was home. Fabian was allowed in an hour later. He stood in the doorway of the cottage with a quality of stillness that was different from everything she had seen from him before. Not the king's stillness, the tactical, controlled composure of a man managing a room. Something else, something unguarded and complete. "Come in," Sophie said. He came in. He sat beside the bed. He looked at his daughter, small and rapt and sleeping with the absolute conviction of the newly arrived, and his face did the thing she had been watching it slowly learn to do over these months. It opened. All the careful architecture came down. Underneath it was simply a man, looking at his daughter for the first time, with an expression that contained everything his language had never quite managed. He started. "She's loud," Sophie said. "She has opinions, she made that clear from the first minute." Something warm moved through his expression. "Good." Sophie looked at him. "I've been thinking," she said, "about the bond." He looked up. She had thought about this carefully. She had made no decision in fear and no decision in desperation, and what she had built in Asheville was hers, genuinely, entirely hers, and the choosing of it could not be taken from her. She knew what she wanted. She had been allowing herself to know it for weeks. "Not because of her," she said. "Not because of politics or alliance or what it does for bloodline claims. Not because you came here and were useful and kind and showed up when the Gravine riders were at the gate." She held his gaze. "Because you looked at me across a table of time leaves and admitted you were afraid. And because you have spent 6 months learning how to be in a room with me without a wall between us. And because I believe, not because I want to, but because the evidence supports it, that you are becoming someone I could choose to be found by." He was very still. "I'm not there yet," she said honestly. "The wound is still real. There are still things we need to say and understand. But I am," she paused, found the right word. I am willing to let this be a beginning rather than an ending, on my terms, on our terms." In wolf law, the bond was freely given, or it was nothing. It could not be commanded or compelled or inherited. It was a declaration between 2 people who had chosen each other with full knowledge of what that meant. He reached across the space between them, slowly, giving her time to change her mind, and placed his hand over hers on the blanket. She did not pull away. Outside the cottage window, the last of the Highland snow was melting off the pine branches in small silver falls, and the sky above Asheville was the pale, clear blue of a world deciding to warm. And inside the room the fire crackled and her daughter slept, and 2 people who had nearly failed each other entirely held hands in the quiet and let it mean what it meant. The bond, when it formed, felt like recognition, like something that had always been true finally being said aloud. She held his hand. He held hers. Their daughter breathed between them, and the world outside kept turning towards spring.
If you enjoy watching this story, please like and subscribe, and I will see you on the next one.